Marcel's talked a bit about the multi-unit dwellings you might be familiar with. I'm going to talk a little bit more about new housing developments. She's touched on some of those things, but I'm going to go into a little more detail. So we're going to talk about, firstly, a bit more detail about the significant growth that lots of parts of Australia are experiencing, what the characteristics of new release areas are, some more of these new types of dwellings that we're seeing, some of the issues related to waste management in those areas, whether DCPs are adequate to address those issues, some potential solutions, and then a summary. So in March, you may remember that the Australian Bureau of Statistics mentioned that the Sydney population had ticked over 5 million people. And we can see from this map where most of that growth is. It's in the western suburbs of Sydney. But it's not just Sydney. The largest growth areas outside Sydney are places like Kingscliff on the Queensland border, Wollongong and Shellharbour south of Sydney, and Maitland in the Hunter Valley. And the fastest growing areas are Kingscliff, Wagga in southern New South Wales, and Shellharbour. But it's not just New South Wales either. These figures from 2015-2016 show growth in other parts of Australia, Perth and Melbourne particularly. There are parts of Perth and Melbourne that are growing at incredible rates. And the message here is that councils that have never had to deal with these kinds of issues, or at least not for many years, will have to deal with them. And the message is to be prepared. And we'll have a look at how prepared some of those councils are a little later. So mostly we've seen greenfield developments on city fringes up until now, but now there's a trend towards infill developments on former industrial sites. And these are in the inner or middle ring suburbs. And the reason is because the value of land outside cities has become more expensive in new growth areas, but also residents want a choice of dwellings in established areas. So just to give you some examples, this is some of the things that are happening in Sydney. The Bays precinct is probably the largest all around Pyrmont and Sydney Harbour. These are former power station, rail yards, docks and industrial areas being developed. In Erskineville, the Rochford former light industrial pocket is being developed for residential. Edmondson Park in Western Sydney is a former defence facility. North Parramatta is the former Cumberland Hospital site. And Clempton Park is the former Sunbeam appliance factory, all being redeveloped for commercial and residential purposes. So looking at the characteristics of these new release households, you can see here this is data from a council in Western Sydney, that the household side, so this is the number of people living in each house, is greater in new release areas than it is in established areas. Now when you compare that to how big those properties are, you can see that the average lot size in this particular council in established areas was almost 700 square metres, but new release areas are an average is 576, and I know that there are some that are as small as 150 square metres. So when you compare that to the household size, you can see that the number of square metres per person is significantly lower per person in new release areas than it is in established areas. So these are some of the new types of developments we're seeing, and Marcel's touched on some of these. Those of you who are my generation will remember that Fonzie lived above a garage. So these kinds of over-garage developments are called Fonzie flats. And the issue here is whether or not these properties have their own title, or are they part of the title for the other part of the dwelling? And if they are, then are they entitled to their own set of bins? Some councils say yes, some councils say no. So you might have two families or two groups of people living there but sharing the same set of bins designed for one family. Medium density developments like this one, the issues here are that the bins are just out in the open. There's no infrastructure at all, nothing to say where they should go. Hybrid houses like the ones that Marcel mentioned, this particular one has 3 dwellings within one freestanding building, and they all have to have bins for waste collection. Some of the problems at curbside include trees, and you'll notice that in this new development how close together the properties are, how narrow the frontages are, and how there are 2-car garages, which means wide driveways. So by the time you've got a wide driveway and a tree, where are the bins going to go? And the other thing to notice here is how close the dwellings are to the road. very few of these properties have a front yard, which also leads to the issue of lower green waste generation. Now, I have the figures and I don't have time to put them up here, but the figures show that, in fact, these kinds of properties do not produce as much green waste as other types of properties, which has implications for FOGO systems and other collection systems. So once you start putting in curbside landscaping, traffic calming devices, those kinds of things, it makes it extremely difficult for vehicles, heavy vehicles, to actually get to the bins in the first place, even if there is a place for them on the curb. Throw in a couple of parked cars and maybe you can't get to the bins at all. This is a property in Western Sydney. This is a rear laneway, and as Marcel's mentioned, lanes are an issue. This particular one, you can see there's very little space for bins at the back of the property where they're supposed to be collected from. So what happens? The truck comes along, picks up the bin and scrapes it up the side of the building. And it's not good for either the building, the bin or the truck. This is the front of that property. Now there's space out the front, but the bins are stored at the back. DCP says you can't take the bins through the house. Once those little trees have grown up, they go into big trees, they arch across the roads, makes it even more difficult for waste vehicles to get through. These kinds of private roads are an issue because council's authority doesn't extend to, for example, booking parked cars, and it's all very well to put signage up and say you can't park there, but if council's rangers can't come in there and book a car, if it's blocking vehicle access, then that's a problem. Storage space is an issue here, as well as noise. I mean, you've got a heavy vehicle collecting waste bins 1 metre from your front door. These kinds of low density driveways, so this is a dead end for, and it's fine for small vehicles, but how is a truck going to get down there and pick up those bins and then reverse safely out around this corner? It's unsafe. So the houses are built so close together that there's very little space either to store bins at the side or to get them down from the back. So people store their bins at the front, across their garages, outside their front doors, because it's convenient. No arrangements have been made. So let's look at some DCPs and see how they cope with these issues. And these are DCPs that come from those councils that are going to experience that growth outside of Sydney. One of them mentions new housing developments. This is a good place to start because this is not too bad. Site waste minimisation and management plan must accompany the DA for a dwelling in an integrated housing lot development. That's great. Bins are to be stored behind the building line and screened from view. It's great. Waste containers to be stored in a suitable location, avoid vandalism. Waste storage areas to be easily accessible, unobstructed access per council's collection vehicle, and placement of bins for collection at the nominated collection point should ensure adequate traffic and pedestrian safety maintained. That's great. It probably could be better, but that's pretty good. So let's look at the others, and they will remain nameless for obvious reasons. 2 of them had separate comprehensive waste chapters in their DCPs. That's great. They did not mention new housing developments at all, and they did not address any of the issues mentioned. Another one had an extensive DCP, but it didn't have a waste chapter or a section on waste. It had a chapter on subdivisions, but that didn't mention waste. Provide satisfactory arrangements for storage and disposal of waste was about as far as it went. And if I was writing a waste plan for a developer, I could drive a waste truck through that clause. And lastly, one had a separate waste chapter, but there was no mention of new developments. It mentioned that smaller scale developments were in fact exempt from the requirements of a lodge of a waste management plan, and these included new single dwelling houses. So, what are the solutions? Well, there's been a lot of talk about how DCPs are just a policy and they're not enforceable, but a clear, well thought out DCP is a good place to start. In my experience, developers are keen to comply with them. Going to the Land and Environment Court and getting into council and arguing over these things costs time, and time is something that costs money. They want to get these things built, so it's easier if they tell the architect at the start, this is what you've got to do, let's just do it, rather than arguing the toss. So nice and clear and well thought out. A DCP that specifically addresses these issues: new housing developments, space for bin storage, space for collection, allocated bin points like this pad that It's a bit different to the one that Marcel showed, but it's another council in Western Sydney. Use the EPA's model DCP. A new one is coming out. I've been helping Marcel prepare that with the MUD guidelines. Not sure what the timing is on that, but when it comes out, use it. It's what it's designed for. It might surprise some of you that developers write their own DCPs for new developments and submit them to council. I wouldn't be allowing developers to put waste into those DCPs. A better approach would be to have an overarching waste DCP that they simply refer to in their own DCP. So, make it clear about Fonzie flats and other multiple title buildings. Are they on title? Are they entitled to their own bins? By all means, signpost and enforce parking restrictions. Even engineering solutions that can prevent small vehicles from parking in T-heads and turning circles, but allow larger truck access. Don't allow private roads. Maybe think about whether a 3-bin solution is in fact the solution. What about communal bins, even for single dwellings? What about occasional bins, especially if green waste is not likely to be produced in such quantities, placed out occasionally for people in the street to use? Even underground systems, I think we're going to hear a bit more about them in a minute. Look at your contracts. Is there flexibility in there for small vehicles, for contractors to bring vehicles in that might be more suitable from another contract? And have clear specifications about rear lanes, their width that suit your collection vehicles. So, in summary, we are expecting significant growth in parts of Australia. Infill developments are becoming more prevalent. New released dwellings are smaller in area and have more residents. There are a range of new types of dwellings coming onto the market. There are challenges with curbside obstructions, street design, on-site storage, and as we've seen, DCPs may not adequately address those issues. So what we need are clear and well thought out DCPs that specifically address these issues. Use the EPA's model DCP. I know Marcel's put a lot of effort into getting it right. It is comprehensive and it covers lots of these issues. Have an overarching DCP that developers can refer to. Make title and bin requirements for properties clear. Parking enforcement and engineering solutions should be looked at. Don't allow private roads. Consider alternatives to conventional bin systems. Contract vehicle flexibility and clear specifications for rear lanes. Thank you very much.